You are watching programming from the East-West Center in Washington, D.C.
Well, good morning from Washington, D.C. Good day, good evening, wherever you are and whatever time you're joining us. Always a pleasure to have colleagues join us for our Indo-Pacific Foreign Policy and Defense seminars. Today we're absolutely delighted to have Dr. Prashanth Parameswaran with us. As you know, he is the author of a new book. Here, I'll show it to you. It's called Elusive Balances, Shaping U.S. Southeast Asia Strategy. And he's going to be speaking on this topic this morning. And we're delighted to have you. Prashanth, thank you so much for joining us. And for all our participants and guests joining us today, welcome. My name is Satu Lemay. I'm the Vice President of the East-West Center, as well as the Director of the East-West Center program in Washington, D.C. Now, you have Prashanth's background. As you know, he's an Asia Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center and a columnist for The Diplomat. He writes mostly on Southeast Asian issues and is a very active contributor to the discussions and debates surrounding U.S. policy in the Southeast Asia and in the Indo-Pacific region. So it's great to have you. And of course, the topic couldn't be more timely in the sense that not only has the Indo-Pacific strategy been released just a few weeks ago, but of course, as many of you will know by now, the most recent plans to have a U.S. Asean leaders meeting have been postponed until further notice in the context of a whole bunch of issues, not least enormous global challenges in Europe and of course, continuing in the Indo-Pacific. So the timing is also great to hear from Prashanth on sort of stepping back from the day-to-day and looking at some structural issues in the U.S. Southeast Asia relationship. So welcome, Prashanth. Over to you, please. And then I'll make some comments and discussion points, and then we'll open it up to our participants.
Great. Thanks so much, Satu, for the introduction and for helping organize this, and also to the East-West Center more generally for all the work you guys have been doing on U.S. Southeast Asia and U.S. Asia policy. I've certainly learned a lot from discussions like these, as well as the written products, the ASEAN Matters for America, for example, that you guys continue to do. So I, as you said, I mean, I think you couldn't have framed it better in terms of the various issues that we find ourselves in as we have this discussion. The postponement of the U.S. ASEAN summit, or special U.S. ASEAN summit, as well as the sort of developments on Russia, Ukraine. I think both of those frame the discussion of the book very well in terms of the approach to U.S. commitment to the region. And I want to just say a little bit about the sort of motivation behind the book. Then I'll just get into the essence of the argument. And then I'll talk through a little bit about policy implications and what we can take away from that, and hopefully we can have a more interactive discussion. I definitely don't want to go too long, and I see there are a number of participants who know a lot about U.S. Southeast Asia policy, and in fact have worked on aspects of this extensively. So I'll say, you know, the sort of hook for the book right now is that we're in the midst of two developments that really get at the issue of U.S. commitment to Southeast Asia. That's really, the book argues, has been the defining issue in U.S. Southeast Asia policy in the past 50 years, essentially since the end of the Vietnam War up to now. If you look at the sort of 50-year period, essentially at various points you have conversations about U.S. commitment to various degrees. Should it be more security focused? Should it be more economic focused? What is the level of diplomatic engagement? How much of it should there be? There's various sort of debates that have been going on, but essentially the current variation of the debate we have is essentially that we have the sort of Russian invasion of Ukraine, while the Biden administration is announcing its Indo-Pacific strategy rollout that includes a significant focus on Southeast Asia. And of course, the questions are rather familiar, right? So whether you had the Bush administration that came in actually with a pretty clear conception that the United States was very attentive to a rising China and wanted to compete actually on that score. But then you had the September 11 attacks and the US attention was driven away from Asia towards the Middle East. you had a lot of actually gains in US policy under the Bush administration, the US-Singapore Free Trade Agreement and so on and so forth. But I think it's safe to say it was overshadowed by that sort of legacy of commitment issue. And so I think the worries right now are pretty understandable in that regard. The big argument that the book makes is that if you talk to, and I did sort of hundreds of conversations with people in Southeast Asia as well as people in the United States, and I think the big first sentence you get is, U.S. commitment in Southeast Asia has kind of ebbed and flowed, right? And there's various imbalances that you see, and these suggest that they're not administration-specific problems. And I think that's a very strong view that I take in the book. It's structured in a very sort of a set of developments and major issues, rather than what did the Bush administration do or what did the Obama administration do. Because I think if we're having these debates over 40, 50 years, that means that there's something that's structurally at issue in US policy. The book's argument is that these structural issues are around commitment, not around power, not around culture. So it's not that for some reason the United States is not able to form an approach to Southeast Asia because there's something inherently wrong with US conceptions of the region. Actually, I think, in writing the book, I think US policymakers are very aware about the issues in US policy. And I think Southeast Asian policymakers, but also Southeast Asian elites are very aware. If you look at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies and you look at the sort of ebbs and flows about how they're thinking about US policy, I think there's an understanding of this issue on both sides. The book's argument is that this has to do with the intersection between two sets of variables at two levels. And that's where the elusive balances framing comes in. One is a set of balances in the US domestic side, and that has to do not only with power and capabilities, which the book pays a lot of attention to. And in the context of US-China competition, I think it's an extremely important variable. But the book looks at the intersection between power and then threats and resources. So it's not only how the United States thinks about power, but how it sort of has these threat perceptions about what's going on, how does it rank its threats, and then how does it mobilize resources to actually respond to those threats regionally and also in the international system. So that's the domestic set of balances. But then when you get to the region, there's a whole other set of balances. And throughout this sort of 30, 40-year period, particularly more recently in US Southeast Asia policy, essentially if you go through sort of accounts and critiques of US policy among Southeast Asian policymakers, they're essentially the same set of issues over time, which suggests, again, that these are structural issues. The imbalance between economics and security, the imbalance between how the United States focuses multilaterally versus bilateral alliances and now increasingly unilateral institutions, the issue of how the United States, when it thinks about adversaries or challengers, it's not just China, but Japan previously, the Soviet Union in the Cold War, how it either underestimates these challengers or it overestimates them in certain cases. So all of these balances from a regional perspective also affect that aspect of US policy. So it's really grappling with the domestic issues and then also the regional perceptions about commitment. And obviously, this is extremely difficult to do simultaneously, balancing between power, threats, and resources domestically, and then attending to these various imbalances that Southeast Asian countries, Southeast Asia in the aggregate, but also individual Southeast Asian countries in a diverse region are all very attentive to. So perhaps, if the United States focuses a little bit more on ideals rather than interests, that might affect certain Southeast Asian countries very differently from how it affects others, depending on their regime type, depending on the relationship with the United States, their own relationships with their populations. So that's sort of the complexities of US commitment to Southeast Asia. Now, the book goes through, and I'm not going to go through the sort of specifics of these episodes, but it goes through 4 episodes in US Southeast Asia policy that really encapsulate the ebbs, flows, and imbalances that I've talked about. One is the sort of post-Vietnam War period. 2 is the post-Cold War period. 3 is the post-9/11 period. And then 4th is the post-global financial crisis period. So you'll notice, as I said, this is not a book that focuses on individual administrations. It's one that focuses on pivot points in US commitment to Southeast Asia. And I think all of these episodes, I'll just briefly say, have very interesting insights about what it says about balance of commitment. So the book's hook for sort of the argument is a sort of balance of commitment framework that deals with both the domestic set of commitments that I talked about and then also regional commitments. In the post-Vietnam War period, I think the really interesting thing is, and the good thing about this period is that we have declassified documents, and I had a chance to sort of go through them. And repeatedly, what you hear from, including from U.S. President Richard Nixon, for example, which is one of the most experienced U.S. presidents when it came to actual understanding of U.S. Asia policy, is that Nixon and his administration, they were very aware of the fact that they needed, the United States was withdrawing from Vietnam. They were essentially the proponents of the Nixon doctrine, for example, were saying we need to rebalance how we're thinking about commitment between what the United States is doing and what regional states are doing. And Nixon, says at various points, our big challenge is that essentially we are withdrawing from the region. We can't do more, but we need to convince Southeast Asian countries that we are doing more. And that essentially is the big challenge for the United States and for US policy. And I think that's very revealing. I think US policymakers have found themselves in this context repeatedly. And Southeast Asian countries have picked up on them, right? What is the difference between US rhetoric and US reality when it comes to commitments? And I think you can look at history and there's a very clear record of that happening. One of the other interesting things that you have in the post-Vietnam War period is that even though you had a retrenchment of US security commitment, US business and economic commitment was actually beginning to increase during that time. In fact, that's when you had the formation of the US ASEAN Business Council. That's when you had the formation of the US ASEAN dialogue to start. And that essentially spoke to the fact that even when the United States was withdrawing on the security side, US policymakers actually found that to provide reassurance to Southeast Asian states, they should try to rely on other stakeholders and they should rely on other realms of engagement to try to buttress up US commitment to make that case, right? The post-Cold War period is interesting for a number of reasons, but I think the big sort of takeaway for the argument in terms of the balance between power, threats, and resourcing is the fact that the lack of the sort of unifying threat of the Soviet Union really led to a period of rebalancing in US policy domestically as well as regionally. And I think the former Singapore Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong really sort of encapsulated this very well when he sort of said memorably that without that sort of clarifying threat or challenge of the Soviet Union, the United States essentially was finding that it was tough to focus on US Asia policy and US Southeast Asia. So the Clinton administration, for example, there were efforts to do sort of a essential all of the above notion of US commitment to the region, right? So the notion of, for example, post-Cold War notion of the Pacific community, or the fact that the United States was dealing with a conception of enlargement and engagement, looking at democracy, but also economic development, but also politics and all of the above, right? And essentially what happened towards the end of this period was that you saw when the United States, when a crisis essentially hit Southeast Asia in the form of the Asian financial crisis, that essentially was the moment where US policy was found wanting. And that still is the episode that defines that period, even though there was a lot of other things that the United States was trying to do in the region, including trying to up some of its democracy promotion efforts and programming that were significant. So that's another case where you have the sort of imbalances come to fore. The post 9/11 period, I already kind of mentioned this, but I think that serves as a really interesting example because, as I said, this notion, for me at least, the book makes a very strong argument that this notion of US-China competition is really not new. US policymakers had been aware of this even during the George W. Bush administration. The key issue is why the United States hasn't been able to focus singularly on the China challenge, and why I think still, in my view, I don't think really that there is a concerted series of actions and programs about what the United States should do itself to respond to that China challenge, right? I think we can all agree that the sort of, that China is doing more in Southeast Asia, But this is not a new debate by any means. And the other thing that's a takeaway from the post 9/11 period is how you can see very quickly a narrowing of U.S. policy around a particular issue, which forms the lens around which Southeast Asia is being viewed, right? The sense that Southeast Asia is not being viewed on its own terms. It's being viewed, whether it's China or terrorism, it's being viewed from that perspective. Now, one of the points I make in the concluding part of the book is that I am not entirely hopeful that this notion of Southeast Asia for its own sake is sufficient to take US policy on forward as of now. I think it's a very compelling argument. I myself, being from the region, living there in the first part of my life, I buy that. I am not sure, though, that we have a bipartisan universal consensus that a focus on Southeast Asia for its own sake is going to be able to get us to where US commitment needs to be in the region. I think it is the case still that we find that China or other threats or considerations are the sort of lens through which Southeast Asia is being viewed. And I think that creates a challenge of its own. And then you have the sort of post-global financial crisis period. The reason why I sort of made that the focus rather than the focus on China is I think when we look at the US pivot to Asia, the rebalance to Asia under the Obama administration, I think it's really important to keep in mind that the Obama administration was very aware at the outset that it was promoting US policy to Southeast Asia during a period of extreme constraints. And that turns out to be what happened. I mean, I think we saw unprecedented levels of US engagement in Southeast Asia that deserve a tremendous amount of credit, including sort of regular attendance at Summitry, the US joining the East Asia Summit. So if we step back, those are significant gains for US policy. But at the same time, I also do think that US policymakers found themselves it being very challenging to actually resource some of these new commitments, particularly on the security side, for example. If you look at US defense budgets during that period, if you look at US commitment on issues like the South China Sea, I think there were a number of Southeast Asian countries that found that was wanting. And of course, not to leave out the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the fact that that was the book makes the argument that really if we step back for a while, it really isn't about just an individual trade agreement. It's the fact that on the economic side, there's so few commitments that the United States has formally to Southeast Asia. So there's the US-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, but really, apart from, US-ASEAN sort of TIFA talks and, previous talks about how can we get to a US-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, it's really tough to find those commitments. And a lot of those commitments are held by the private sector or individual US government agencies. And so the TPP would have been a way for the United States to stay committed formally to the region on the economic side. And that still, I think, is a big loss. We're seeing the Biden administration now focus on a sort of Indo-Pacific economic framework that could help a little bit, inching the US policy forward. But that was a big step backward, I think, during that period. So where are we now? I think we're in a period where, using the framework, the sort of balance of commitment framework in the book, the Biden administration finds itself where the United States is extremely aware, I think, about the increased challenge from China. So there's increasing threat perceptions. But I don't think that we have an agreement on what to do about the resourcing challenges, significant resourcing constraints that the Biden administration has. And that's domestic challenges that we all are familiar with, political polarization, difficulties sort of getting actual budgeting to match the US commitments to the Indo-Pacific and to Southeast Asia. And then also the fact that just as we had this Indo-Pacific strategy rollout, including documents that were supposed to come out on the national security strategy, the national defense strategy, I suspect those documents will require a little bit more refining now that we have the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And that this notion of either, Indo-Pacific, Euro-Atlantic, whatever we want to sort of call it, that the United States is going to have to deal with multiple theaters over time. And that's something that the book sort of argues very clearly for, that the United States is always going to be a global power. It's not going to change anytime soon. So that balancing how the United States deals with other theaters in the world, even as it focuses on the Indo-Pacific and Southeast Asia, is going to be a significant set of policy considerations moving forward. So I'll just end with just 2 or 3 recommendations. And I don't want to sort of belabor the point here, because I hope to make it more of a discussion. But I think the sort of ways to think about this in terms of the commitment issue is the first thing that I think is really important, not just for the Biden administration, but I think successive administrations to do, is to recognize that if we step back, the chief problem for US policy in Southeast Asia on the commitment level is that in certain areas, there aren't just a lot of US commitments, right? If you look at treaty alliances, it's just Thailand and the Philippines. Those are a little bit looser, and the allies are less capable than you find in, say, Australia, for example, or Japan. But really thinking about strategic and comprehensive partnerships, what the Obama administration did, and now under the Biden administration, you're finding a little bit more investment in, and making those commitments binding so that future administrations are not going to be able to basically withdraw from them. It's really important. I think all of us are aware, but in doing several book engagements in Southeast Asia, the first question I'll get is sort of, where are we after the midterms and a next administration coming in that's not the Biden administration? Are we going to see really a retrenchment from US policy? So I think that notion of locking in commitments and institutionalizing commitments is really important. And then I think managing and moderating commitment balances is really important. I think one where the Biden administration has found itself in a period of challenge is this notion of ideals and interests. And I realize there's compatibility and crossover between those two, but when you look at engagements like the Summit of Democracy last year and the Democracy Summit, I know this is something that the president himself is personally committed in. And I think that's definitely something that's part of the US DNA. But I think customizing it for Southeast Asia and Southeast Asian states, particularly where Southeast Asia is now, where you've seen a lot of rollback and retrenchment on democracy, focusing a little bit more on governance challenges that are more specific that these countries care about and governments care about. Issues like, very simple issues like tax evasion, environmental degradation in places like the Mekong, for example, can help, I think, set the table for a two-way conversation. The other one is sort of diversity, equality, and inclusion, which is a shared challenge for both the United States and Southeast Asia. I think can get us to a better, more granular place than an aggregate conversation about democracy that focuses just on regime change and all of that, which I don't think the Biden administration is trying to do, but I don't want to either underestimate how this will be perceived in Southeast Asia, given other periods of US policy in the past and perceptions in that regard. And then the final thing I'll say is, how to calibrate threat perceptions. And I think this is an issue that I think is still very fresh in Southeast Asian minds. I don't think that there is a sense that from the Trump administration's period, where really the US consensus, to the extent that it existed on China, was shattered, broken, disrupted. I don't think there's a sense that there's a new consensus that has emerged on that. And I think Southeast Asian minds will sort of search for what that will look like. But I think at the same time, focusing not just on threats and challenges, but just opportunities in Southeast Asia, right? This is an extremely young and vibrant region. And I think a lot of the opportunities are in specific economic sectors and people-to-people ties. That's really where the energy is. And so even as we're focused on the China challenge, I think it's really important to not lose sight of the opportunity side. And so the book argues for a sort of threat opportunity balance in how US policymakers are thinking about Southeast Asia, just to make sure the balance of commitment is struck in the right way. And I think last point I'll sort of make, when you look at the Indo-Pacific economic framework, for example, that the Biden administration is propagating, and I think we can all agree that's not a trade agreement, it's not where we would like US policy to be, but I give the Biden administration tremendous credit for thinking about this and actually setting out a framework to think about sectoral issues like supply chains, like climate and energy, sort of structuring this in a more economic sense, only because my own view, my own bias is that it was really great that we had a US-ASEAN strategic partnership under the Obama administration that formalized engagement. But I think that strategic partnership is a little unwieldy. I think there's a myriad set of priorities. And I think there's a real big opportunity under the Biden administration, which is why, to your point, Satu, on the US-ASEAN summit, I thought it was a bit of a lost opportunity, and hopefully we get that convened soon, to focus on, what are the 3, 4, 5 top sectors and areas that we can focus on. And that's something which I see a lot of convergence between the United States and Southeast Asia. Thinking about climate, thinking about sustainability, thinking about digital. These are things that I think there's a lot more cooperation. So even if we can't think about big things to do in U.S. Southeast Asia relations, and it's tough to do those things, I think we can start sectorally and build out from there, even if it's a lower base, get a few Southeast Asian countries that are willing to work with the United States, and then try to build it up from there. And I think the final thing I'll say on the US ASEAN summit is we've seen some comparisons to Sunnylands that happened towards the end of the Obama administration's second term. And I would just say, I think that gives the Biden administration a bit of a short shrift because the US ASEAN summit and Sunnylands of the Obama administration was supposed to cap a series of achievements and successes in US policy over 2 terms. Right now, the Biden administration is trying to start with a summit and then try to get started on that energy, which I think is a good idea. But I don't think we should allow that to distract from the other things that are going on. And I think it's really good, actually, that we're having the summit early on rather than something that's towards the end of the Biden administration. So I'll conclude there, and I look forward to your comments and the discussion and the questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much, Prashanth. Terrific overview of your book, and I look forward to reading it more closely. But I had the advantage of a little bit of a summary from you and an article that we will put out in our Asia Pacific Bulletin series. So wonderful to have that. Let me tell you a couple things, a few things that I really appreciate about the book. First of all, it's really nice to have a book on U.S. Southeast Asia relations that sort of looks at it systematically, structurally, and then puts it in combines a kind of theory with historical elements. And the second thing I really liked, we've had some wonderful books, including from folks on this call, I think, Murray Hebert, maybe there are others, on looking at Southeast Asia between the US and China, which really valuable contributions to the discussion and the focus. And as I said, the final thing that I really enjoyed was, looking at these post periods, post-Vietnam, post-Cold War, post-9/11, post-GFC, global financial crisis, and tying them into sort of more structural issues about the challenges that pose. But in the spirit of our discussion, and those are the things I like, let me raise a few issues that struck me, again, without reading word for word your book, and I hope to get to that. One is, call me old-fashioned, but I don't think the end state of US policy or foreign policy, forget US policy, any country's policy should be either balance or commitment. I think that's is a way of framing things, but the end state should be what interests are achieved by engagement with a set issue or country or region or what have you, institution, organization. So I've, first of all, always been a little reticent about getting balance and commitment right, as opposed to getting outcomes right. And so that's sort of one flag. The second is, I'm so pleased you interviewed a lot of Southeast Asians, but by the nature of the book, and perfectly fair to focus on US policy, it focuses on the supply of US things to the region and not the demand. And I think that interaction is really important in Southeast Asia, because the demands are very different for the supply of balance and commitment. People are looking for different things. And so US policy has had to navigate, ride lots of different issues given the country in question. I mean, if you look at it structurally, you didn't mention that Southeast Asia itself has expanded. I mean, in your written comment, in your oral comments, verbal comments, Southeast Asia itself made a pitch to expand what it means to be Southeast Asian. And it did so only after the end of the Cold War. And that created a whole new rejiggering of the balance between mainland Southeast Asia, maritime Southeast Asia, not to mention ASEAN as an institution. And huge changes in the trajectories and fates of countries in the region. Democratization in Indonesia, if you will, for the lack of a better word, the rise of Vietnam, the sort of downplaying of Thailand in this context, of its traditional role as a really big player, not only in mainland Southeast Asia, but across ASEAN. I mean, there's a reason, US embassy Bangkok was one of the bigger, but Thailand has taken a slightly different tack. And I'm not talking about just post-2014, but its role generally. The first thing, and the other thing I really like is sort of trying to think systematically about the attentiveness to the interrelationship between power, threats, and resources. And I kept wondering why this was unique in Southeast Asia to US policy. I mean, if I talk to my Latin America friends, I started out as a Middle East specialist, to my Middle East friends, or for that matter, European friends who a few years ago were wondering, what does a pivot or a rebalance to Asia mean? What kinds of, power, threats, and resources do you anticipate? So those are my big comments. Let me make a couple that relate to your conclusion, and then we'll go to open it up, because the whole idea is to, get some additional input from our participants. I'm wary of making too many, pushing for binding commitments in Southeast Asia. Our alliances in Southeast Asia, both formal treaty, are great. Of course, we should have the alliance with Thailand and Philippines. But I sense that in both of those capitals, they are also seeking a slightly less rigorous and rigid. And you're arguing for a stricter one, but I'm not seeing that demand side, as it were. I'm not seeing the demand side ask for a much thicker, more binding, more rigorous, more straitjacketed alliance, but rather a somewhat more flexible and looser one. To me, in some ways, a model of this is Singapore, which in the context of the Ukraine aggression by Russia, continues to not move towards an alliance position. But since you're talking about post periods, post-Philippines decision on US bases and the natural disaster, of course, post-Cold War, it was Singapore that stepped up without being an alliance partner, doesn't want to be a formal alliance partner, and yet continues to do things in practice that make it clear that it views US presence and US commitments as both reliable and welcome in the region. Vietnam is writing a balance internally, not to mention within the government and VCP, domestic politics, its relations with other countries, China, what have you. So I'm cautious about arguing for more binding commitments in an environment that is may not have the demand side or the purchase that we need to make those. I think we're in a different kind of era in Southeast Asia. The second thing is about customizing. You said about democracy, and I really like your point, because I'm a big believer that instead of the sort of formal push for democracy as the word, the issues of governance, fair representation, individual rights, anti-corruption, transparency, accountability, all promote democratic end states without the formal focus on electoral per se, and as we all know on this call, it's an extraordinarily complex area. But I got to tell you, I took a very different view from this Indo-Pacific strategy. I believe I counted, and someone will now correct me, but in my counting of the words use of democracy and human rights, there's no action call for in the 10 action statements for democracy or human rights. In fact, it's quite interesting. If I remember correctly, I don't have a strategy in front of me. One of the 10 action points was governance and accountability, or governance and transparency. But again, someone can easily check the empirical record. But I found it sort of unusual. I expected there, given the Democracy Summit and others, to be even more, if you will, heavy-handed on democracy and human rights. But what it really said is, hey, there's a whole bunch of other things that really important to the democratic end state of individual rights, freedom, expression. So I think we're moving down that path in an era of contested geopolitics, which actually provides more room for the US-Southeast Asia relationship rather than less. And the third is about calibrating the threat perceptions versus opportunities. Totally agree with your point. I think it's an excellent point, well made. But I got to say, for the last 15, 20 years anyways, our commitment to the Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative, our commitment to economic arrangements on a bilateral basis that are sustainable. Now, TPP is, in my view, judgment, a real downside. But there are people who would argue, for example, that the tariffs on China have created more space for supply chain resilience and engagement with countries we might not have. And there are downsides to that too, as we know, with the trade deficit increasing with Vietnam. So again, these calibrations are not going to be mathematical. They're not going to be chemistry. They're not going to be physics. In the real world of policy, choices and discussions, debates, but also most importantly, an implementation of interest outcomes, we're going to have to change. So the final thing I'll say is, I think one thing perhaps, and maybe your book makes a greater point of this, and I should refer to it when I read it in detail, is I think you leave out a whole bunch of other things that are really important to Southeast Asia beyond US policy towards Southeast Asia. And I'll cite three. One, I think the global order for Southeast Asia still matters. Oh, it's dented and it's bruised and it's frayed and it's fracturing. But without the global order of a decolonized post-war Southeast Asia, those countries could not be where they are today. And yeah, we got all kinds of problems with WTO, but Southeast Asia still remains largely rule takers, not rule makers in the system. And the general rules that still are clinging to relevance in this new contested geopolitics is very important. The second public good that the US has created after the World War II that I think is important for Southeast Asia beyond the sort of narrow bilateral policy is the relationship with other allies and partners. And so the rejuvenation of Japan post-World War, I mean, we forget now, but the emergence of Japan as the second/third largest economy in the world, Australia's important role in the region, Korea's development into the, eighth largest economy in the world, I'm not sure the exact number, vibrant democracy. I think our European project, meaning the EU and NATO, all of these things are a second layer of the public goods that the US has created in the international system on which Southeast Asia really relies. And if you look at EU investment and trade data with Southeast Asia, it's actually more important than a number of other partners that we normally think about. So let's not forget that. And I would just parenthetically note, in the IC survey, you mentioned Japan, you mentioned views of the US, but it's interesting to me here at the 70-year mark that Japan is the most trusted player in the region, one that's more than others expected to abide by global rules and be of utility. So that's and the third one I would say is I get that our multilateralism record is, how shall I put it, mixed. I mean, America is a reluctant multilateralist at best. And it's certainly been a reluctant multilateralist in Asia for the hubs and because of the hubs and spoke system and what have you. But still, the United States has not pulled the rug out from ASEAN, despite Southeast Asia's own rather mixed commitment to ASEAN themselves. And so, yeah, we're navigating bilateral and multilateral, but this order that we've engaged in at the behest, in some cases, of Southeast Asia, even when the outcomes or output for the United States are, shall we say, suboptimal, remains a kind of Southeast Asian demand that we have at least acquiesced while not tying our hands in pursuing trilaterals or minilaterals or Quad or AUKUS or what have you. And why that's important to Southeast Asia as a public good is, it is my assessment, and people can disagree, that whatever complaints there may be about America's multilateral public good approach, if the net outcome is more US commitment and more US presence and more US reliability, that is something that is on the demand side of Southeast Asia in the supply side, demand side equation. So let me end it there with some comments. And again, thank you for your terrific contribution to our discussions, and open it up to the floor. And I know there are people watching on live stream YouTube today, so I welcome all of you, and I will read the questions because as you know, you cannot see the questions that are submitted here. And so let me go here to the Q&A and find a question. So there's a, please don't mind my pronunciation. There's an assistant professor, Anucha, who has asked, whereas the relationship and diplomatic approach of China is personal, and that's in quotes, folks who can't see the question, and multifaceted compared to the US and Western approach, and more closely conforms to Asian culture, do you think that the US and the West will be capable of being more adaptable in future to be more successful? Also, the US / Western approach is more openly confrontational, which does not appear to conform with Asian culture. What say you to those issues of culture and approach? And
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I addressed the sort of cultural arguments in the earlier part of the book. Frankly, I'm a bit skeptical of those arguments, only because we see, as I said, the big framing question is, on the U.S. side, and this kind of gets to your point, Satu, as well. I think very much the book's framework is a little bit of a juxtaposition between issues on the supply side and issues on the demand side. So on the supply side, it's the sort of power, threats, resources issue. And then on the demand side, it's this list of, I think some would call them lamentations or complaints from Southeast Asia, right? So like, why are you not focused as much on ASEAN relative to alliances? Why, it's too security focused rather than economic focused. And I think the adjustments speak to both the fact that these transcend sort of cultural divides, but then also there's so many changes, as you rightly noted, Satu, in the region, right? So the big one, the focus on mainland Southeast Asia relative to maritime Southeast Asia is huge. And then ASEAN's changing role as well in that framework. So I would say, and in the context of democracy and governance as well, I think this plays out. I think we had this, debate about Latin America and, can they democratize, and then, Northeast Asia. And then now I think we're in a similar conversation on Southeast Asia. And I think it's more of the threading the needle between democracy and governance and how we talk about it, and talking about it as a two-way conversation, as you said, rather than one that is, more sort of one-sided, right? And I think actually one of the things that has been good coming out of the Biden administration on this is Secretary Austin last year, when he spoke at the IISS in Singapore, sort of brought up the discrimination against Asian Americans in a speech that was supposed to focus on security mostly. And I think that there was a sense, I think, in parts of the region that the United States is at least recognizing that it has its own issues. I think where I'm a little bit concerned is a little bit on the Biden administration's, there's an audience problem, right? An audience challenge. And that's the other aspect that the book kind of gets at, which is US policymakers, when they're trying to get domestic support for policy, have to play up some of the challenges in a more global and regional sense, including China. But when you do that in a Washington perspective, it distorts how US commitment is perceived in the region. And then you're straitjacketed because the regional responses come in, right? And I think that's probably more of a challenge. So there's a messaging component, I think, more than the sort of cultural issue. I would put more of attention on capabilities, perceptions, and messaging, which I think is a real challenge for US policy. Oh, Satu, sorry, I think you're on mute.
Oh, I beg your pardon, Prashanth. Thank you for that. And Professor Anucha, thank you. Let me now turn to a question that's come in from a Mr. Michael Larkin. Hello, Dr. Parameswaran. Do you think the commitment problem that you've discussed is also an outgrowth of a regional approach? I take that to mean Southeast Asia regional approach that currently appears as security heavy instead of presenting an economic and governance vision. So how do you assess sort of where Southeast Asia is on this.
Yeah,
Kind of
well,
a discussion about debate, demand supply, where some countries want security, some countries want economics, some want to be left alone,
No, it's a good question because it gets to your point, Satu. I think it's an excellent one that you can kind of frame commitment as an issue, as a framework for thinking about U.S. commitment to get a little bit beyond this whole sort of, every administration, it seems like we have a conversation about, how much should we focus on ASEAN? How are we too militaristic, so on and so forth. So the balance of commitment framework is a useful approach to frame policy from both the sort of US domestic side and then also the regional side. But then the question is really, what do you do? And I think part of that is what US policymakers do. But the other aspect is what is happening in Southeast Asia. And the fact is, as you pointed out in your comments as well, and Michael pointed out in his question, there's various issues and challenges in Southeast Asia as well. I mean, the relationship between how these countries engage with their own people is changing. And I think we're seeing a lot more sort of bottom up forces changing the way these individual Southeast Asian countries are relating within their populations as well as with each other. And that's where I think you have probably ASEAN's, I think in my view, the primary challenge in ASEAN is really how it remains still a very elite driven project. I think it's played a tremendous role in terms of reinforcing stability. I think if you woke up ASEAN's founding fathers and told them that every year you're going to have a debate about whether the US president's going to attend ASEAN summitry, I think they would be very shocked and surprised. So I don't want to understate ASEAN's the sort of inroads it's made, but I think on this sort of elite driven versus people focused, people centric community, I think ASEAN still has a lot of work to do, and these individual countries are also changing. So you don't have, as the former ASEAN Secretary General Surin Pitsuwan used to say, like, we don't have the legacy of Mahathir or Marcos having that sort of domestic political continuity. There's so many disruptions that are happening in terms of governance in Southeast Asia as they're dealing with these challenges. And I think that's a really important point. And then I think one other thing that I wanted to emphasize, I think it's a really good point that you made, just tying into Michael's question on the broader regional and international forces. I think that's tremendously important because, to my mind, if we look back at the last 20 years, it's not, the big story is not that the United States has pivoted or rebalanced to Southeast Asia. It's that really everybody is pivoting or rebalancing to Southeast Asia, which is testament to Southeast Asia's growing importance, right? Europe is doing more in Southeast Asia, Japan, South Korea, Australia. I think that presents the US with opportunities to partner more with US allies and partners, to dock onto various aspects. But I also think it raises the bar for what the United States is doing itself. I think there's increasingly, I find myself in conversations in Southeast Asia, variants of the question, what is the US competitive advantage? Like, so if we're talking about one or two or three issues, what can the United States do, right? If you look at infrastructure, for example, I remember talking about US-China competition in a sort of Southeast Asia roundtable, and somebody corrected me and said, I don't see if you look at infrastructure, there's no US-China competition. It's really China and Japan and a few other countries. So talking about competition in this framework where everybody is doing more in Southeast Asia, what are the different spheres and specific issues? So maybe it is, the US has a role on supply chains, but maybe on infrastructure, it's not the United States actually that's the most well-placed to do that. Maybe it's other countries. Maybe on climate, certain US administrations may have a role to play, but others, you may actually see a retrenchment in that commitment, as we've seen over the past few decades. And so maybe the EU has a bigger role and more sustainable role to play on that. And so I think that conversation about, one of the pieces of feedback I got, writing the book is, how would you apply this to other countries? So could we talk about a balance of commitment framework for the EU, for Japan, for Australia? And I think that's a very interesting, that's obviously not what the book is about, but I think that's really a good place to start, because it's a comparative conversation. We don't live in a region where Southeast Asians are only talking about the United States, right?
Right. No, that was the point I raised. How would it be different in the Middle East, or how would it be different in Latin America? Look, in fact, your last comment, Prashanth, is really wonderful. We now have a couple of other entries, both in the chat and Q&A, and I'd like to go to those for our YouTube live stream listeners. Piper Campbell, Ambassador Campbell, who, as you know, served in ASEAN, in line with your book's recommendations, if you could write the agenda, because you were talking about infrastructure, climate change, for a rescheduled US ASEAN summit, which has been currently postponed, what would you list as priorities? What can the US and ASEAN members realistically work on at this time? I mean, given all that's going on, where we are, I mean, I think the present period, it's so much strikes me as your first pivot period that you identify, post-Vietnam. Racial riots in the US, huge domestic debates, huge focus inward, highly polarized and contested politics. What would you say that we should prioritize in a US ASEAN summit? What would be the outcome that would be mutually beneficial? And then we've got about 10 minutes, Prashanth, and I've got 2-3 other questions. So why don't you go here first, and then we'll move to the others.
Great. No, it's an excellent question. I think my sense is that the Biden administration, on the issues that they focused on, it's probably the right place in terms of traction. So what we heard about ahead of the summit, things like energy and climate, education, a little bit of a focus on specific economic issues like supply chains, for example, and digital. Because I think you want to go where the traction is in the region. And if we just remove the United States, a good way to think about this is just remove the United States from the equation. What is happening in Southeast Asia in terms of the trends in the region? You're seeing a lot more conversation on digital, including the conversation in ASEAN as an aggregate, a lot more conversations on energy and climate. And I think a lot more awareness about human capital. I think there was a recent engagement at the U.S.-Indonesia Society. The Indonesian ambassador of the United States spoke a lot and very passionately about human capital and how that matters for Indonesia's own domestic development. And I think the United States can play a tremendous role in all of those domains and realms. Now, obviously, there are things that are going to come up as part of the summit that don't have a lot to do with Southeast Asia. China, Russia, Ukraine, and some of that, as you alluded to in your comments, too, will be concerns that U.S. policymakers need to navigate as well. But I think that, along with the sort of goal in the next few years to elevate the U.S. strategic partnership to a sort of comprehensive strategic partnership that a number of other countries have done. The question to my mind is, you can elevate the relationship, but where are the 4 or 5 priorities that are focused on? And then do you have enough officials and ministerial dialogues to kind of buttress that, even if presidential level commitment might not be sustained over the next 4, 8, 12, 16 years?
Thank you. We turn now to our colleague and friend, Renato de Castro, I think from Manila, I think. Very important public good that the U.S. has provided to Southeast Asia, and we discussed this before, is its role as a strategic offshore balancer. Its security commitments to the region, its ability to project power, etc. This role is made possible by the presence of a sizable forward deployed forces in the region. How do you see this role? I think he means to say, how do you see this role will be affected by the possibility, of the Ukraine-Russia war and the need to beef up NATO against future Russian expansion? Will it divert strategic attention and resources, notwithstanding, and he doesn't say this, but notwithstanding the IPS first action statement is, new resources. But here we are, a land war in Central Europe, where, we have talk about changes in German security and defense policy and others. How do you think this will affect U.S. ability to continue this offshore role?
Yeah, I think that's definitely right, that the U.S. security role as an offshore balancer, continues to be important. I think, to my mind, the big issue in terms of U.S. commitment is, this relates to the question, but also a point you raised earlier, Satu, about you can try to have more binding commitments in terms of how they tie the United States and Southeast Asia, but you want to be probably flexible about the kinds of commitments, whether it's formal alliance or partnership or exercises, and I think I do agree with you that in terms of the U.S. security role, if the United States is trying to do this while also dealing with global challenges and a changing region, which I agree wants to be a little bit more focused on sort of looser, more flexible commitments, it will have to change a little bit how it's thinking about security. And I think we're already seeing that. The focus on non-traditional security, war legacy issues in the U.S.-Vietnam relationship have helped us get to where we are today, where we can talk about all these issues. I think that has tremendous value in terms of how we're thinking about other countries as well. The relationship with the U.S. and East Timor or Timor-Leste, for example, it may be very small now, but I think it was significant that we've seen officials like Eli Ratner talk about Timor as being part of that alliance and partnership framework. So my sort of vision for how U.S. security commitment looks like in the next 10 or 15 years is that it's sort of the alliance framework is fine, but the partnerships and thinking about security from a more comprehensive perspective can help navigate some of the sensitivities that individual Southeast Asian countries have about more formal binding security partnerships with the United States. And then I think on the Europe and the Ukraine piece, I think frankly, it's the NSC's Edgar Kagan spoke, I think last week at the Hudson Institute, and he sort of said something that I think is very fair, which is ultimately we can say whatever we want, but we know that the region is going to judge us by our actions and how we do our resourcing. So on the defense side, I think the next U.S. defense budget is going to be extremely important in terms of telling us U.S. policymakers are going to be saying things, but how is resourcing for individual budget line items affect what happens in Asia and then what happens in Southeast Asia as well? And then of course you mentioned the Philippines too. That's going to be something that's pretty significant in terms of, you have a changeover of administration and what does the post Duterte landscape look like for the U.S.-Philippine alliance. I think there was hope that perhaps after Duterte, we might go back to something that was resembling the past. But I think, as we've all talked about, there's a lot of deeper trends behind changing administrations and leaderships that have to do with how individual Southeast Asian countries are thinking about a changing region. And we need to be well poised to react to those.
Yeah, no, that's great points. And not to mention, if I might just add there, Prashanth, in the spirit of our discussion on this topic, that quite apart from what I consider to be relatively short-term changes, meaning Ukraine impacts and resources impacts, which are, critical, but sort of, we'll see in a year, out year budgets, et cetera. There's some big structural issues. What does it mean to project power in a region where you're confronting China and Russia? Is forward, you've seen the debates in War on the Rocks and other pieces. What does forward posture mean? It's not 1945. It's not 71. It's not 1991. It's not 2001. What does it look like 20 years, 30 years? If we have another pivot point in 20 years, what would it look like to have posture in the region? How would posture be helpful? Where would it be helpful? What kind of posture would be helpful? So I think, those kinds of questions, not to mention, again, not to harp on it, but how much does Southeast Asia want to do on that front? How receptive is Southeast Asia? We've been having discussions with the Philippines on the alliance management. We've been having discussions with Thailand on access and alliance management. We've been having discussions, quite productive ones, with Singapore on alliance presence, management, and engagement. So these kinds of things are, I think, part of Renato's questions. So we'll keep watching that. The final question, I'm afraid, comes from our distinguished professor at University of Virginia, Professor Brantley Womack. And his comment, and then he has a pungent question at the end of his comment, which is, and you're a UVA grad, a cavalier, Prashanth. So the Beltway tends to judge the US and Chinese presence in Southeast Asia as an either or, while in the region, the last thing countries want to do is to make a choice. Who is unrealistic here? Over to you.
Thanks. So, I think just to respond a little bit, so Professor Womack was one of the professors that is most responsible for a lot of what I know about Southeast Asia, China, and the broader geopolitics of the region. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. I think the question is excellent on choices. I think we're seeing the administration increasingly receptive to that, and I think adjusting to it by reframing the question as the United States wants to actually increase the choices that Southeast Asian countries have. And I think the awareness really is that frankly, I mean, I think in a lot of Southeast Asian countries, the question is, what is the U.S. choice, right? What choices is the United States offering on its own terms? Because the unpredictability of U.S. engagement and commitment makes it difficult. So it's clear what China is offering, right? I mean, you may disagree with it, but it's very clear what they're doing. But in the US, I think there's a perception that every 4 or 8 years, that choice is different. And what does that look like now versus 4, 8, 12 years? It's a different conception. So some of those things change. I think one other thing that I would say on Professor Womack's question and also your points too, it's actually really important, and the book emphasizes this. The United States can dip in and out of the region, sort of on ebbs and flows, but when the United States comes back and re-engages, the region has changed, and so has the world, right? So it's very important, actually, whenever we sort of apply these conceptions of commitment, to not only to balance that sort of in the book spirit, right? There's the domestic balances on power threats and resources, but in Southeast Asia, the perceptions of those balances will change as well, quite significantly. So when we're talking about US defense posture, we have been talking about, right, since the end of the Cold War, we've got to broaden the alliance and partnership framework. We have to engage with certain countries on how we do security assistance. But when you look at the actual progress, there's a progress on exercises, progress on different sort of individual security issues. But we're a little bit behind on how Southeast Asian countries are changing their own conceptions of security. So maritime postures, coast guards, illegal fishing, a lot of things we haven't talked about in the last 20 years, we're talking a lot about more of today. And that will require more interagency collaboration that's beyond just the Pentagon. And that interagency conversation, I think the regional case for how complex these challenges are makes the case a little bit for more interagency cooperation, and also a role by Congress, frankly, right? Congress is a really important role in terms of emphasizing the continuity between administrations, even when you see these ebbs and flows. And I think that's going to continue to be important in the next few years.
Prashanth, I said that was the last question, but it was my failure to read the chat simultaneously with the Q&A. So there is one question from our colleague, which sort of relates to Professor Womack's question about China and the choice and the balance, et cetera. And this is William Titrello out in San Diego. His question is, what impact have Russian actions in the Ukraine have had on Southeast Asian leadership's concerns about China's more aggressive policy? I'm not don't want to sort of read into what Will is asking here, but there is one element is, well, China pursued the kind of aggressiveness that some have accused it of doing in the region, obviously, which is just, China acting like Russia. And we've talked about this, Taiwan, but there's another element, which is Russia-China tie-up. What does that portend for Southeast Asia? You want to make a quick closing comment on that? I know we're a couple minutes over, but I thought we should get that question in the spirit of Will having put it in the chat. Please.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I would say there's two aspects to that. One is, as you said, Satu, the sort of, it complicates this notion of like, China is the first challenge we're dealing with, and then it's maybe Russia, Iran, North Korea, and then it's non-traditional security challenges. I think it points to the fact that these challenges are very related. And in fact, China benefits from the United States that's more focused on Europe and what Russia is doing outside the region, and it does the focus on the Indo-Pacific, the same thing that we saw in the Middle East, for example, where the United States was focused a little bit more there, and China was making inroads in the region. I think the other aspect that's really interesting is, Russia's own engagement in the region, because frankly, in the last 5 years, you've seen Russia try to make a big play for regional engagement in Southeast Asia. And I know there's a tendency to dismiss that and say it's all just military equipment, but I think Russian officials were talking a little bit more about diplomatic engagement. How can they expand ties even with US allies like the Philippines? I suspect now, though, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we may be back to that more transactional approach where Russia is trying to look at these various links in Southeast Asia individually rather than something that's more sort of orienting and comprehensive. But we'll see. I mean, I think it's definitely interesting to look at this, based on just really what the Russians are doing in Europe versus what they're doing in the Indo-Pacific as well. We shouldn't forget that they've been trying to make a play for that as well, just as China has been doing.
Well, stay tuned, folks. That could be the subject of Prashanth's next book, right, Prashanth? And
Maybe.
we but just joking with you, don't want to put further burdens on you, but absolutely delighted. I hold up the book again and encourage you to make Prashanth rich by buying Elusive Balances, Shaping U.S. Southeast Asia Strategy. Thank you, Prashanth, for taking the time, the energy, and the generosity to join us for this Indo-Pacific webinar series at the East-West Center. Delighted to have you. Thank you all the participants who joined us today. A really rich discussion, and I thank you for all your questions and comments in the Q&A and chat. Stay tuned as we roll out additional programs that are forthcoming. And we invite you again to sign up for the East-West Center newsletter, events, publications, and fellowship opportunities if you are not already on our mailing list. With that, good morning from Washington. Good day, good evening to you wherever you are. Thank you, Prashanth. Good day, everyone. Be safe,
Thanks.
be happy. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Satu. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.